been isolated from trade with the outside world after unprecedented Western financial sanctions, the Russian government has found it increasingly challenging to replace their losses in tanks, aircraft, artillery, and especially microchips and other advanced weapon systems to continue fighting on an effective 21st century war. But by the end of 2022, one country had stepped up above all the others to begin supplying the Russian war machine with much of the equipment it needs to continue staying in the fight: Iran. As the winter season of 2022-23 set in, hundreds of Iranian-manufactured kamikaze drones known as the Shahed-136 suddenly began appearing across the battlefield in Ukraine under Russian service. The Russians would go on to use swarms of these relatively inexpensive Iranian-made drones to help bombard Ukrainian civilian infrastructure into rubble by overwhelming their air defenses with sheer numbers. A tactic which eventually contributed to roughly half of the Ukrainian electric grid getting knocked offline in a deliberate campaign of terror. But it's not just the drones that the Iranians are actively sending to assist the Russians either. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, better known as the IRGC, is the unconventional, asymmetric, and ideological military wing of the Iranian armed forces. And by the end of 2022, they had deployed many of their own military advisors and soldiers on the ground within the Russian-occupied sections of Ukraine. And in addition to the hundreds of kamikaze drones, the Iranians have also been providing the Russians with much-needed ammunition, artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and body armor to help keep their inventory stable and to help keep them fighting on for longer. The Iranian regime has gone all in on militarily supporting the Russian side during the invasion of Ukraine, in much the same way that the Americans and Europeans are actively supporting the Ukrainian side. But the growing cooperation between Moscow and Tehran extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine, and the world may just be witnessing the birth of a full-blown Russian-Iranian military alliance that could define the 21st century in the region. In many ways, this makes perfect geopolitical sense to both sides at the moment. In the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian Federation received an unprecedented hailstorm of financial sanctions from Western and Western-aligned countries from around the world, to the point where it suddenly became the most heavily sanctioned regime on the planet, with more than triple the amount of sanctions levied against it as the world's second most heavily sanctioned country, Iran. The two countries ended 2022 and entered 2023 as the number 1 and number 2 most financially isolated pariah states in the world. And so they each have few alternatives right now to trade with than each other. As a consequence, Russian exports to Iran have risen by more than 27% since the invasion of Ukraine began, while Iranian exports to Russia have risen by more than 10%. Russia has since agreed to invest more than $40 billion into helping develop Iran's natural gas infrastructure, while the Russians even helped the Iranians launch a satellite into orbit last August that the Pentagon claims is helping Iran's drones operate over Ukraine. While extremely ideologically opposed at the national level, Iran and Russia also ultimately view themselves as sharing the same common enemy in the form of the United States and the collective West. Iran and Russia have for years now fought together on the same side to prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And ever fearful of a potential future conflict with the United States in the Persian Gulf region, the Ukrainian battlefield grants the Iranians a valuable opportunity to test their own military hardware on the Russian side against American-supplied hardware on the Ukrainian side, so they can analyze how they stack up against each other. At the same time, Iran and Russia both complement each other militarily extremely well. The Iranians are capable of supplying the Russians with a lot of the ammunition, drones, rockets, missiles, and body armor that they need to keep fighting in Ukraine, while the Russians can and now actively are supplying the Iranians with some of their advanced fighter jets, helicopters, and air defense systems like the S-300 and S-400 that the Iranians need to defend their nuclear weapons research facilities from potential Israeli or American airstrikes. There's even the potential for the Russians to one day go even further and do what was up until recently completely unthinkable.